There are plenty of seats up front. There's about 3 in the front row, 1 in the second row, 1 in the third row. So if you don't want to stand, please feel free to come up here. There's also some seats in the center here in front, so there's no reason to stand.
Welcome to our 2019 Believe Week Speaker Series. The NYU College of Business has been celebrating ethics in business education with a variety guest speakers since the fall 2006. Believe stands for Building Ethical Leaders using an integrated ethics framework. Our collective vision for Believe is to be a leader in fostering core ethical values and moral courage from the classroom to the business world. We do this by giving you, our students, faculty, and alumni, practical tools to navigate ethical challenges and to give voice to your values. You are going to face ethical dilemmas in your career. We want you to have the skill to recognize these situations and the tools to think through and choose the best actions for you. How many of you carry your Believe card? How many of you have Believe card? If your hand isn't in the air, make sure you pick up a new one at the end of this afternoon's presentations. Believe card over there. And now I'd like to introduce a great friend to NYU and the College of Business, Mr. Jed McClure. And Jed McClure is, And Jed McClure is a successful entrepreneur and award-winning author. He has built multi-million-dollar companies in multiple industries, is an accomplished public speaker, and has received widespread praise for his ability to educate and inspire others. In 2013, a business partner embezzled millions of dollars from one of his companies and killed 2 partners. At great risk to his own life, Jed spent more than a year exposing his former partner and uncovering evidence that would later be used in his arrest and conviction. Having survived 2 attempted murder plots and enormous financial loss, Jed is passionate about preventing fraud and teaching others how to protect themselves. In his various business endeavors, Jed accumulated more than $10 million in assets in under 2 years, created a manufacturing and distribution company with more than 100 employees and more than $4 million in revenue in the first year, and an oil field service company that operates more than 115 oil tankers on a daily basis and generates $5 million in revenue a month. Jed's talents for strategic planning, risk evaluation, business organization, and leadership were key success factors in his ability to lead these organizations to explosive growth and success. But a single business mistake allowed a conman to destroy everything he had built. Rather than defeating him, Jed learned from his experiences and created invaluable tools for preventing business fraud in the future. Today, one of Jed's greatest passions is using what he learned to teach other people how to avoid the same mistake he made and help them prevent fraud in their own business and investment endeavor. So we really welcome you to NYU, the College of Business, this evening, and thank you for coming.
The year is 2013. It's 2 weeks before Christmas. I should be out shopping for presents for my family. Instead, I'm hiding in a dark hallway outside my son's bedroom door. I've got the phone pressed against my ear with my shoulder, and I'm frantically shoving shells into my shotgun. The phone rings, and every time it rings, I'm terrified that they're going to hear. Finally, on the third ring, Special Agent Derek Trudell answers the phone from Homeland Security. I don't even realize I'm holding my breath until it explodes out of me in a panic, a relief panic. Here was somebody that could help. I moved down the hall, explaining the situation to Agent Trudell. You see, just a couple minutes before, I had come out of my office at home, into my kitchen, and through the front window, I saw two guys in my front yard. But they weren't exactly in my front yard. They were actually in a shadowy alcove in my front yard, effectively hidden from the street by several bushes and a large tree. Now, under normal circumstances, I would have gone outside and confronted the guys, asked who they were and why they were standing in a hiding place in my yard. But these weren't normal circumstances. Just 3 days before, a work associate came home from church to find a hitman in his home waiting for him. He was shot 7 times in his living room. That hitman was hired by my business partner. So I didn't confront these guys. Instead, I slipped further into my home to avoid detection. And my concern turned to fear as I watched these guys walk around my home looking for the best way in. They eventually came back to this alcove with a ladder and climbed on top of my roof, where they were at that very moment as I was on the phone with Special Agent Derek Trudell. I said to him in a whisper, "I need you to be honest with me. Does this have anything to do with James?" And he said very calmly, but with authoritative urgency, he said, "Jed, you need to do exactly what I say. Hang up the phone and call the police, then call me back. Do not let them see you. Do not confront these guys." So I immediately hang up the phone and I call 911. The operator answers on the very first ring, and I say, "There are 2 men at my home, and I think they've been hired to kill me." Now, it's not very often that you meet somebody who is the target of hired killers. In order to understand how I got here, I need to take you back to North Dakota at the start of the oil boom, See, North Dakota, prior to the oil boom, was a rural farming community. We're talking about small, closely knit towns, honest people who wore their overalls and their boots proudly, who were more than happy to lend a cup of sugar or a few eggs to a needy neighbor. They were not prepared for the changes that would take place when the oil boom happened. And some of those changes were good. In fact, for some people, they were really, really good. Thousands of people essentially became overnight millionaires. So many people, in fact, became rich that one politician actually joked that in North Dakota, a new person became a millionaire every single day. Of course, he was a politician, and that was a joke. In reality, in 2012, a new person in North Dakota became a millionaire every 4.5 hours. And residents weren't the only ones to benefit. The government benefited too. While California was issuing IOUs to their vendors and employees, North Dakota was bringing in $10.5 million a day in oil taxes. Their education fund had a surplus of $1.3 billion, and they established a legacy fund that was growing at a rate of $1 billion a year. For most people in North Dakota, the boom was a God-sent miracle. It spelled the end of the Second Great Depression. But where there's good, bad always tends to follow. And North Dakota was no different. Tens of thousands of truckers and oil men converged on the state, rapidly monopolizing their vital resources, sending the prices of the barest necessities skyrocketing. This huge influx in population actually caused a huge strain on the state's resources, a huge strain on the government services whose whose Midwestern small town values were not prepared for the Wild West winner-takes-all mentality of big oil. A shadow crept across the region, and like a plague, its dangerous and corrosive shadow seemed to invade every segment of society. Reported assaults in North Dakota between 2010 and 2012 increased by 500%. And those were just the reported assaults. Most truckers I knew, they preferred to handle problems their own way. Drug trafficking and drug crimes on the border of North Dakota and Montana more than doubled during that time period. In fact, huge increases in crime occurred across the entire state. Things were changing in North Dakota. The boundary between small-town morals and boomtown debauchery was fading as neighbors fought with neighbors, as prostitution and alcohol ruled the nights, and as companies increasingly stole from their own employees. And unfortunately, the police were too few and too ill-equipped to keep the pot from boiling over. The sad reality is during this time in North Dakota, it was too easy to lie. It was too easy to steal. It was too easy to feign ignorance and pass on the blame to somebody else. In North Dakota, it was too easy in the dust and the noise to mask that something evil had come to town. This was the oil boom in North Dakota during one of the largest oil booms in American history. Now for myself, I'm not from North Dakota, but I grew up in a similar type of community. I was the second oldest of 5 children. I was raised in a devoutly religious family in a devoutly religious town in southern Indiana. As a youth, I was fiercely independent, competitive, ambitious. Though if you had asked my mom, I think she would say I was rebellious and headstrong. Nevertheless, these kinds of qualities as an adult, as an entrepreneur, have been invaluable. But as a youth, they just got me into trouble. All the time, got me into trouble. So to help harness my creative energy, my parents put me into Boy Scouts. Now I say put me into Boy Scouts, I didn't really have a choice. Nevertheless, I thrived as a Boy Scout. I loved it. I learned invaluable lessons through the scouting community, through spending countless hours camping with my friends, earning merit badges, performing service. I learned the value of loyalty, of integrity, of kindness, of compassion. I also learned the value of work and creativity. And I had my first entrepreneurial experience as a Boy Scout. When I was 13 years old, all my friends were going to scout camp. I really wanted to go, but $150 a week, there's no way I could afford it. My family couldn't afford it, we were poor. So my scout leader and I came up with a plan. He went to Sam's Club and he bought a case of 1,000 blow pop suckers. You know what blow pop suckers are, right? They're the big suckers with the gumballs in the middle. So he bought 1,000 blow pop suckers at a cost of 7.5 cents per sucker. Every morning I would take a 1-gallon Ziploc bag, I would fill that bag full of suckers, I would stuff it in my backpack, and I would take it to school where I would sell them for 25 cents a piece. Now, word traveled really fast, and I became really popular because I essentially had a monopoly on selling candy in the school. So it wasn't uncommon for me to, during the passing period, come to my locker and find a crowd of students, all with quarters in hand. It took me 3 weeks to pay for scout camp, and I had my first taste of being an entrepreneur. My first taste of making my own money, and I loved it. I loved it because I loved making money. And don't get me wrong, I love money. I love everything I can do with money, but I love the process of making money. That experience fundamentally changed the way I looked at the world. When I went to college, I started my first 2 companies. Started an eBay company where I basically bought stuff in bulk and resold it. Then I started a medical supply company where I drop shipped products to patients. Both these companies were small. In fact, they barely paid the bills. After all, I was still basically a kid. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know anything about running a business. I just know I enjoyed the process. And I learned a lot of valuable lessons running those companies. For instance, you know those guys on the late night infomercials that say you can be a millionaire and run a successful business in 4 hours a week in your spare time while you travel the world and do all the fun stuff you ever wanted to do? Yeah, those guys are full of crap. As it turns out, running a business is really hard. It requires a lot of work. In fact, it never ends. It never ends. A lot of people these days tell me, I want to be an entrepreneur one day. I want to run my own business. And of course, I just kind of laugh and say, no, you don't. And they say, no, I really do. I say, okay, why? What about being an entrepreneur do you really like? What is it that appeals to you that makes you want to be an entrepreneur? And they say, well, I want the freedom to be able to work when I want to work and do what I want to do. And I just chuckle, and being someone who doesn't like to crush the dreams of others, I say, I hope that works for you. So when I left college, I decided these companies, I was done. They weren't really what I wanted to do. I wanted to get into real estate. Now, I didn't know anything about real estate, except I heard a lot of people made a lot of money investing in real estate. I wanted to be one of those people. So I decided the first thing I would do is go learn about real estate. So I went to the local library and I read everything they had on it. And I quickly realized that if I really wanted to learn real estate, I wasn't going to learn it from a book. So I went out, I took the required classes, I got the license after taking the test, and I joined a real estate agency. Now, I didn't want to be a real estate agent, but I realized I needed to be in the trenches in order to learn about real estate. So I joined this agency. I sought out the top salesperson in the agency, and I convinced him to let me shadow him for the next several months. And he was cool with it. So for the next several months, every deal he did, every call he was on, every closing he went to, I was there. And I learned a lot. I learned a lot about real estate. I learned a lot about business, because he was a very savvy business person. But I also learned a lot about people. And one lesson I learned about people lie. A lot. In fact, people lied so much in the real estate industry, we had a saying, buyers were liars. So let me give you a common scenario of what would happen. I'd get a phone call from a potential buyer. She would say she was interested in buying a house. I would say, what's your price range? She said, I can afford $200,000. I'd say, have you talked to a banker? She said, yeah, I've talked with a banker. I'm approved for a $200,000 loan. I would ask her some more questions about her finances just to make sure. Then once I was satisfied that she could afford the house, we'd start talking about specifics. She'd tell me where, what kind of house, details. I would spend the next several hours looking through the MLS, and I would identify homes that I thought she would like, that fit her qualifications. I would send these to her, and we'd go through this process 3 or 4 times where she would go through, she'd pick the 1 or 2 or 3 that she liked, she'd get rid of the rest, we'd do it again. And we'd narrow it down to 6, 8, 10 homes. Once we've narrowed it down, then she and I would go out to those homes, and we'd do walkthroughs. And this process usually took 3-5 hours a day. And we'd usually do this 2 or 3 times. More often than not, and that means more than half the time, we'd be partway through the process. I will have already spent 5, 8, 10 hours, and I will have discovered through the course of the conversation that she lied about something. The most common lie was that she didn't make as much money as she claimed. Doesn't seem like a big deal, except if she doesn't make as much as she claims, she can't afford the price range that we're looking in, which means all the houses that I've been looking for, all the houses we've walked through, she can't actually afford. We've got to start over. That was the most common lie. There are others. Sometimes she wasn't even interested in buying a house. Sometimes she was remodeling her own home and wanted to walk through homes and get ideas of how she should remodel. Sometimes she was just really interested in the new homes and what they look like. Sometimes she'd be contracted with another agent and just wanted to see if I could find something different. Now, the thing is, these weren't big lies. She wasn't trying to actively deceive me or defraud me or con me. She wasn't trying to harm me in any way. This was a little lie. Just a little lie. Right? It wasted my time. But when you're in an industry where you only get paid commission, and you only get paid commission on homes you sell, that waste of time meant a lot of money. Now, what's interesting is these little lies were never a big deal to buyers. In fact, on the few occasions when I brought this up to buyers, buyers were consistently surprised and even offended that I would suggest that they had been dishonest with me. Apparently, when it comes to buying a home, little lies are A-okay. Unless you're the agent, of course. So I was with this company for 6 months. 6 months and I was done. I wanted to move on. I started a real estate investment company. I felt I knew enough. I got 3 investors. They put up the money. I did the work. This was a good deal. In under 2 years, we accumulated over $10 million in assets with over $8 million in equity. Not a bad deal. Then the Great Recession hit. Real estate tanked. It was time to move on and do something else. So my friend and I decided we're going to start a manufacturing company. We're going to manufacture products, we're going to distribute. We actually started just distributing products, other people's products. And we worked really hard. We were doing sales 12 hours a day. Sometimes we'd go on road trips, he and I, and we would start at the top of one state, and we would go and we'd hit every single convenience store in every single town as we drove from the north of the state all the way to the south of the state, and then back up. These trips would take 3 or 4 days, and we were road warriors. Hard work. By the end of that first year, we were manufacturing our own products. We had built a manufacturing facility. We had 60 plus employees. We operated in 14 states. We had done over $5 million in sales that year. And I was really excited about this industry because I was kind of fed up with the people in the real estate industry because I worked with too many people who weren't business people, and they didn't understand the value of time. But now I was working with business owners. I was working with people who worked 15 hours a day, every day, all the time. They absolutely understood the value of time. I was excited about this. As it turns out, convenience store owners are way worse than non-business people. They lied nonstop. It was a consistent culture. As long as you were negotiating, it was okay to lie about what you were doing. If you thought that you could save a nickel, it was okay to lie. I cannot tell you how many times a store owner told me that he talked to somebody in my company who promised him some kind of a discount, which never happened. After a year, I was really fed up with this industry. I decided, I'm out. I can't do this. I need to go to an industry where people are honest and upright, where they work hard and they have integrity. So I left this industry, and naturally, I got into the oil industry. Yeah, I think you guys have an idea where this is going to go. So I met James Hendrickson, in the spring of 2011. I was introduced to James by a mutual friend who thought he and I would be a good fit. When I first met James, I was actually taken aback by about how similar he and I actually were. We were the exact same age, same height, similar body build, dark hair, clean cut, wore nice clothes. Getting into personality, we had very similar personalities. We were both outgoing, we were both charismatic. We both had this ambition and drive to succeed. Meeting James, it was like meeting myself. So obviously I liked the guy. To get an idea of what James was like, he looked like a young Matt Damon. He was very physically fit. He wore custom-tailored, tight-fitting clothes that showed off his muscles. He had a very disarming smile with the whitest teeth I had ever seen. I mean, unnaturally white. I know what you're thinking. You're probably thinking, this guy sounds like a narcissist. Yeah, he was. But that's not what I saw. When I met with him, I saw somebody who paid attention to detail. I saw somebody who knew the importance of appearance and making a good first impression. And when you're starting a business, those things are really, really important. The fact was, James walked and talked like he was someone who mattered in the world. And people followed him. So James and I sat down and we talked about his idea. He wanted to start a trucking company in North Dakota in the oil boom. We talked for hours about his experience and about his goals and what he wanted to do. I wasn't actually convinced that he had the right strategy. Fact is, I didn't know anything about the oil business or North Dakota or trucking. But I know how to run a business. I know the qualities that it takes to be successful. If you don't know something, you can always learn it. If you don't have a technical skill, you can develop it. Or better yet, you find somebody that has it and you hire them. But that motivation, that ambition, that drive, that fierce determination to be the best and to succeed, I don't know that you can learn that. James and I, we had that. And as a result, we made an incredible, powerful team. So I spent the next 3 months learning everything I could about North Dakota, about the trucking industry, about the oil industry. And piece by piece, I put together a strategy. I talked with James every single day. We developed a strategy, and by July of that year, I was convinced our strategy would be successful. So we launched Blackstone Trucking. We started with buying one truck and trailer for $100,000. We bought it used. I have to be honest, that truck and trailer was a piece of crap. But we fixed it up, we made it work. Within the first week of buying it, we had it operational. Within the first month, that truck had made over $30,000, running 23 hours a day. So we bought a second truck, and a third and fourth truck, and a fifth and sixth truck. And then we started expanding. We started bringing in more equipment. We started doing more things, offering more services. By the end of December of that year, 5 months in operation, we had brought in more than $500,000 in profits, and we were running 14 trucks a day, plus a whole bunch of other services. In February of the next year, 2 months later, we landed our first major contract. Within a month, we went from running 14 trucks a day to running 115 trucks a day. We were billing $5 million a month, and we were bringing home about $1 million a month. This was great. My strategy worked. I was thrilled. On the surface, everything was fantastic. But that's not to say that there weren't problems, because there were problems. Lots of problems. In fact, every day we had a new problem, a new emergency, a new something happened that would eat up my time. I would joke that my job turned from being a strategic manager to being a professional babysitter and problem fixer. Because that's what I spent most of my time doing, was fixing problems. Aside from those problems, though, I started to see red flags. I started to see things that made me really concerned. And I first started at the end of spring. Every month, our accountants would put together financial statements. We'd look at the entire health of the company and what it had done the previous month, as well as individual trucks. And I started noticing financial discrepancies. $250 here, $400 there, $1,200 here. Little financial discrepancies. For instance, one month, a truck had small tool repairs. These are things like repairing a tire. Small tool repairs of $1,225. And the next month, that truck would have the exact same cost on small tool repairs. That seems unusual. The next month, it would have the exact same cost on small tool repairs. That's unlikely. I would go to James, I'd go to the accountants and say, hey, something's going on with these numbers. Best case scenario, our accountants are being sloppy. Worst case scenario, somebody's fudging the numbers here. And James and the accountants would say, yeah, that's weird. Let me look into it. I said, great, get back to me. And I'd promptly get pulled into some problem, and I'd forget all about it until the next month. And I'd get the financial reports, and I'd see a financial discrepancy again. I'd go to James and the accountants and say, hey, what's going on with these numbers? And by the way, you didn't tell me about last month's numbers. And they'd say, oh yeah, we forgot about that. And oh, that's weird. Let me look into it. I'll get back to you. Now, I want you to understand, though, because a lot of people have said, wow, those are really big red flags. How did you not do more to figure out what was going on? And they were red flags. Absolutely. The thing was, every time that we did service for a company, we issued a ticket. It was like a receipt. This is what we used to bill. We were issuing, on average, about 8 tickets per truck, 115 trucks per day, about 800 plus tickets every single day, and we were billing about $160,000 every single day. So when I saw that financial statement once a month with a $1,200 discrepancy, it didn't seem that urgent. It turned out it was. At the time, it didn't seem like it. In fact, at one point, I actually did the math and realized I'd be losing money spending 6 or 8 hours of my day tracking down what was going on with that $1,200 discrepancy. I should have paid more attention to it. Turned out it wasn't a $1,200 discrepancy, it was a multi-million-dollar discrepancy over 115 trucks. But I didn't see it at the time. There were other problems. We had a high turnover rate with our employees. A very, very high turnover rate. A super high turnover rate. As in, we never kept a trucker for more than 90 days. Now, I didn't know enough about the industry to know that was actually uncommon. I knew turnover was really high. I knew we were working with transient truckers who didn't live in North Dakota, who traveled to North Dakota, spent 3 to 6 weeks working every day they could, then would go home to their family for a month and come back and do it again. So when I wasn't seeing truckers for more than 90 days, I didn't think a whole lot of it. It was a problem because there was a cost associated with bringing in new truckers constantly. But I didn't think it was a problem until I started hearing rumors that truckers were leaving because they were getting ripped off, because they weren't getting paid. I didn't directly manage the truckers. I looked into it. The problem was, it was always a rumor. I never once met an actual person who told me they were ripped off. I heard lots of rumors. At one point, I became so concerned about these rumors that I pulled over 2 truckers and I said, look into this. find out what's going on, track down where the rumors are coming from. I want to know, because if this is a problem, it's something that needs to get fixed. About a week later, they came to me and they said, oh yeah, we tracked it down. It's that trucking company down the street. Obviously, they don't like you. They're trying to destroy your reputation. It was North Dakota. It was the oil industry. It was cutthroat there. In February 2012, just a week after we landed our biggest contract, that took us from 14 trucks to 115 trucks a day, I get a call from James, and he is irate. I'd never seen him so mad. He's yelling and screaming and swearing. He tells me that one of our managers, a guy named Christopher Clark, or KC, was building a competitive company and was planning to steal our contract. In fact, James had just gotten off the phone with an executive at the oil company that we worked with, and KC had just called him and set up a meeting to go in and to get our contract. So James was very upset. So I let him rant for about 5 minutes or so, and that was about all the time I could allocate to it. And we moved on to other things. At the end of the conversation, I came back to it, and I said, is this situation with Casey going to be a problem? And by this point, he was calm. He said, no, I'll take care of it. I said, okay. He did his thing, I did my thing. I didn't hear anything about it from James. I never heard anything from him directly about it, ever. 2 weeks later, I did bring it up. I said, hey, what happened with Casey? And he said, oh, Casey's such a flake. I think James, let me back up and explain. I think James took it really personally with Casey because he and Casey were friends. They've been friends for like 10 years. The whole reason that Casey was actually in North Dakota is because James invited him to come work with us. James and Casey used to race motorcycles in North Dakota, in Washington State. So when Casey did this, it really affected James. So I said, what happened with Casey? And he said, Casey's a flake. He always does this. Things start going well, he self-sabotages. Then he freaks out, he gets in over his head, and he disappears. And nobody sees him for 3 months, 6 months, a year. Nobody sees him for a while, and then he shows up again, pretends like nothing ever happened. I didn't know Casey. I said, okay, this is your friend. That was that. Over the next several months, I became increasingly concerned about these discrepancies. In fact, to the point that I was now convinced that James was lying to me. And not just James. I was convinced the accountants were lying to me as well. But I didn't have the proof. Everything changed on November 2nd, 2012. I got an email from a friend. The subject line just read, "You need to see this!" Exclamation point. Clicked on the email and it just had a link. My first assumption was that it was a cat video, and I almost deleted it. But when I saw the link, there was something that caught my attention. There was a word. It was the word Gimp Daddy. Now that probably doesn't mean anything to anybody, except I had once heard somebody call Casey Gimp Daddy. Casey was in a biking accident several years before, and his right leg he had a metal rod and nails in his, or screws in his leg. And he had a limp, so they called him Gimp Daddy. I saw this in the link, so I clicked on the link. The link took me to a Facebook page created by Casey's mother, who alleged that Casey never left North Dakota. In fact, he was never seen again. Obviously, this was very disturbing. As I continued to read the post, she made a lot of other accusations. She claimed that James was a career criminal, that he had lots of felony convictions. She claimed that his name, James Hendrickson, wasn't actually James Hendrickson as we knew it, that he used a different spelling of his name to hide his criminal past. The problem was, there wasn't any proof. There were a lot of posts of people saying stuff. There was no evidence at all. So I contacted Casey's mother. We had a phone call. I talked to her for about 2 hours, and she told me the most outlandish stories I've ever heard. She told me about how James had been involved in all kinds of burglaries and robberies and assaults, how he had run a drug operation in Washington, how he was working with the Mexican cartel, how he was working with the mafia in California, how our company was a front for a drug operation, how two of his partners were nabbed by the Mexican cartel and were executed, and that he was actually in North Dakota hiding from them, while simultaneously smuggling drugs with our trucks. None of this was the James I knew. Fact is, I didn't really believe anything she said. Except I had this suspicion. I knew that he was lying to me. I couldn't prove it. But everything she said just made me more concerned. She told me she was working with a lady in North Dakota who specialized in finding missing persons. This lady's name was Lissa Yellowbird. So she gave me Lissa's number and I called Lissa. And Lissa repeated a lot of the same stuff that Casey's mother had said. But again, no proof. So I paid for Lissa to go out to Washington State, where James was from, to go to the courthouses there and get any and all public documents that she could. I also knew James lived in Oregon. So after Washington, I sent her to Oregon to try to track down any criminal history, any records she could find. I also put her on the financial situation. I wanted to find everything I could. It took 1 week. 1 week to confirm all my fears. She came back literally with a box of hundreds of pages of arrest reports, of convictions, of court filings. He had been arrested and convicted of burglary, of assault, of sexual assault. He ran the largest drug operation in Oregon's history at the time. How he wasn't in prison, I had no idea. We also discovered at least 6 at that time, at least 6 different companies that he had created and put under his wife's maiden name. These companies were created in other states. He did this to hide these companies from me. All of these companies worked for our company. They were all subcontractors. Now, most of our companies that worked for us were subcontractors, so we had lots of them, and guess who oversaw the subcontractors? James did. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars were paid to these companies that technically didn't even exist except on paper. But on our books, they looked like they were doing work. So I waited until I had everything. I waited until I had solid evidence of everything. And I confronted James. And he lied to my face about everything. And I kind of did the dad thing, where I asked him a question I already know the answer to see if he was going to be honest with me. And he'd lie to me, and I'd pull out the document and say, I know you're lying to me. And then he would change his story so fast. And I was really impressed with how quickly he could change his story. But I saw this consistent pattern of how he lied. And I realized he had been doing this consistently from the first day I'd met him. And he was really good at it. But I was onto him now. I could tell. Every time he lied, he had certain tells. Every time he lied, I knew it. Well, that conversation didn't go so well. Sure you can imagine. And I didn't play it so well either. Because I told him, we're done. We're not partners anymore. We're dissolving the company. You'll hear from my attorney in the morning for division of the assets. Before the end of the day, it all disappeared. Every bank account was wiped clean. Every truck, every trailer, every generator, everything that we had disappeared. I immediately went to the police. The police said, this is a civil matter. I said, he stole millions of dollars. They said, yeah, tough. That's not really something we do. Sue him. I hired an attorney. We began the long process of filing the lawsuit and gathering the evidence. In retaliation, James hired a hitman in Chicago. He sent one of his thugs to Chicago, paid him $10,000 cash to come to my home and to kill me, with the promise of another $20,000 when the job was done. I actually saw the text that James sent the guy with my address in it. The guy they hired was called The Wiz. He was a drug dealer in California, or in Chicago. He was a drug dealer. And it turned out he was more of the let's get high and chill kind of drug dealer rather than you cross my path and I'll kill you kind of drug dealer. So when James paid him $10,000, he told the authorities later on, when investigated, that it was the easiest $10,000 he ever made. They had no intention of killing me, that he took the money gladly and kept it. Now, how true is that? I don't know. Of course he's going to tell the police when they investigate him that he had no intention to kill me. Did he come out? I don't know. I really don't know. The police gave him immunity later on when they investigated him, gave him immunity to testify against James. I didn't know anything about this. So I'm pursuing this lawsuit. And after a couple of months, my attorney says, there's no collectability. You're wasting your money. At this point, I had spent about $20,000. And he said, there's no collectability. I said, what about all my money? He said, yeah, what about it? Where is it? We don't know where it's at. We have since those first 6 companies found another 6 companies in other states created under James's wife's maiden name. We don't know how many more companies there are. We don't know if any of them have this money. With the evidence we have, you're going to win your lawsuit, and there's probably no likelihood that you're going to collect it. You can imagine that kind of pissed me off. I mean, it seemed like this guy was going to get away with it. I started pulling every string of law enforcement that I had. The FBI and Homeland Security, at the IRS, even at the Postal Service with the postal inspector. I went every route that I could. I met Derek Trudell of Homeland Security in the spring of 2013, and he agreed to take the finance fraud case. Nobody else would. The only reason he agreed to take the case was he was convinced that James had killed Casey. But there's no evidence. Casey's body never turned up. Nobody was giving any information. So he figured if he couldn't get James on Casey, then we're going to get James on the fraud. The problem is the wheels of justice turn slowly. And when you're a person that's just been ripped off millions of dollars, slowly is not nearly fast enough. So I decided to take matters into my own hands. I created what I called the Beware poster. So basically this was a FBI Most Wanted poster, except instead of Most Wanted, it said Beware. Had James's picture and his wife's picture, their names, their aliases. As it turned out, they were using multiple aliases. A list of all the companies that they owned or operated, and a whole list of all of James's criminal convictions. Dates, file numbers, everything that you needed to prove that he was a criminal. I made this poster. With Lissa's help, I mass mailed it to 5,000 businesses in the North Dakota area. Within 2 weeks, that poster was hanging up in every restaurant, every bank, every gas station in the region. I didn't stop there. I sent that Beware poster with a cover letter explaining my history with James and 2 conviction notices. And I would fax those every single Monday to every single oil company in the region. I did that for 6 weeks until every single company blackballed James. I contacted the tribal chairman and the tribal council, the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation. This is where we did most of our work. I sent them a 108-page packet outlining everything. James was kicked off the reservation. I created a website. On this website, it had a detailed timeline. It had every single document. You could literally just click on whatever link and it would pull up every single document there was. Whether it was a police investigation report or it was a court notice, whatever it was on that website. James was somehow able to get that website taken down. So I did another one. And he got that one taken down. And then I found Ripoff Report. And this was a website that's controlled by some overseas company. And it's created so that people who experience fraud can post information about their fraud, and it can't get taken down. So now it was there to stay. In retaliation, James hired a second hitman to kill me. He attempted on multiple occasions to lure me to meet with him in North Dakota, where the second hitman was going to ambush me and kill me. At this point, I still didn't know how dangerous James was, but I suspected. So I never went. After that, James disappeared. Had no idea where he was. Our money's gone, our equipment's gone, James is gone. His wife was still living in the house that they had purchased in North Dakota, but James was not there. So Lissa decided she's going to go undercover. James and Sarah, James's wife, they didn't know Lissa. Lissa reached out to Sarah. Over the next couple of months, they became really good friends. As in really, really good friends. They talked every single day. Sarah frequently cried on Lissa's shoulder about how she couldn't go into town because everywhere she went, her picture was hanging up. I didn't feel a whole lot of sympathy. We found out where James was. He was working in Wyoming. We knew he was working with a company. We didn't know which company. We knew he was working with someone who was acting as a front for him. We didn't know which. Until I get a call one day from a former trucker who recognized one of my trucks. And it was on the Indian reservation. And I had a big sticker that said Bridgewater Energy. So I investigated and I found that Bridgewater Energy was actually filed, the registered agent was the accounting firm that our company used. The same accounting firm that was involved in the fraud. So I knew this company was tied to James, but I also found that the same company was also registered in Washington State to a guy named Douglas Carlisle, who was technically the owner of the company. So this guy was the front. I contacted the Indian reservation. I had Bridgewater kicked off the reservation. What I didn't know is that James and Carlisle were both trying to con each other. North Dakota during the oil boom. They were both trying to con each other, and James got really ticked off. He hired a hitman to show up at James's home, at Carlisle's home, and murdered him in front of his wife. James made some big mistakes, though. Number one, he had threatened Carlisle. So Carlisle told all his family members, if something happens to me, James is responsible. So a couple days later, when Carlisle was murdered, all his family said James did it. The problem was nobody knew who James was. They knew his name. They had a phone number to a burner phone. They knew he was in North Dakota somewhere. They didn't have his last name. They didn't have any other information. Almost by accident, the detectives stumbled across my rip-off report. And now they had it. They knew who he was. Fortunately, the hitman, as he escaped, dropped a glove. That glove had his sweat in it, which meant it had his DNA. He was a convict, so he was in the system. 4 weeks after Carlisle is murdered, the police raid his home and arrest him. They find a hit list, a national hit list. Apparently, James had used that as a selling point to hire his hitmen. Do a good job for me, and I've got a whole bunch of work for you. He also had a list of things to do, practice using his gun, equipment to use on the murder. Things unraveled really quickly. The very next day, they raided James's home in North Dakota. James's right-hand man, a guy by the name of Robert DeLeo, went straight to the FBI and he turned evidence. He turned informant. And he did it fortunately at a good time, because James actually had hired somebody to kill DeLeo, to kill the hitman who had killed Carlisle, and to kill James's wife. It's going to wipe them all out. They knew everything. Unfortunately for James, the person that he hired was the cousin of Robert DeLeo, who immediately went to DeLeo and said, hey, this guy's trying to kill you. Get out of town. James's wife went into protective custody. She got immunity to testify. DeLeo ended up getting 19 years. James went into hiding. He was found a week and a half later as he was trying to leave the state with his new girlfriend. There were a whole bunch of other people that were arrested that all ended up pleading guilty to various parts of the conspiracy. James was eventually convicted of 2 counts of murder for hire, 4 counts of solicitation to commit murder for hire, and 4 counts of conspiracy to commit murder for hire and solicitation to commit murder for hire. He got 2 life sentences plus 120 years. Oh, and there's also a conviction for possession of in excess of 100 grams of heroin with intent to distribute. Did I mention that our company was being used as a drug operation? That was true. That experience kind of shook my faith in humanity. And I often wondered, how is it that good people can do bad things? Because James isn't what actually worried me. James was, as it turned out, a psycho. But there were a lot of people. There were a lot of people that knew what was going on. There were a lot of people that said nothing. Or they actively covered up. People that I considered to be good people. And the more I thought about it, the more I started seeing this consistent pattern. I go back to the convenience store market, and everybody lied a little bit. And I went back to real estate, everybody lied a little bit. I started seeing this consistent pattern and wanted to know why. And so I spent a long time really reading everything I could to understand why. And I've got 5 rules that help me understand why good people do bad things. And those 5 rules have helped me to recognize when I'm in a situation where I am more likely to engage in bad behavior, as well as when I'm in a situation where other people are more likely to engage in bad behavior that could affect me. So the first rule actually comes from a psychologist named Dan Ariely. Dan for a long time, studied truthfulness. And he did a lot of experiments to test truthfulness. I'm going to tell you his basic experiment. He'd go to a university, he'd get a group of participants, and he'd take them into a room. He'd give them a sheet of paper that had 20 math problems. It was a math test. He told them, I will give you $1 for every math problem you finish, but you have 5 minutes to finish them. Seems simple enough. The math problems weren't that hard, but they're kind of complicated, so they took time. He ran this experiment several times. At the end of 5 minutes, he'd tell people to stop, count up how many they got right. They'd come up to the front. They would tell him, he'd pay them how much money they had earned for the number they completed. The average number completed was 4. 4 math problems in 5 minutes. So now he changed up the experiment. Now when he brought groups in, gave them the page with the math problems, told them, I'll give you $1 for every one you finish. You got 5 minutes. They'd do the math problems. At the end of 5 minutes, he'd say, stop, count up how many you finished. Then I want you to go to the back of the room, put your paper in the shredder, shred the paper, then come up to the front of the room, tell me how many you finished, and I'll give you $1 for every one you finished. As far as the participants knew, there was no way to confirm what they told him. They could tell him anything. That paper was destroyed. But in fact, it wasn't destroyed. What he did was he rigged the shredder. He took the teeth out of the shredder, except for the sides. So when he would feed the paper in, it would shred. They'd hear it shred. It would pull the paper in. It would just shred the edges, and the body of the paper was complete, so they could see how many problems people actually finished. But nobody knew that. Turned out when they ran this experiment, the average number that people claimed to have finished was 7. 7. Went from 4 to 7. In reality, it was still 4 when they checked the papers. But people claimed 7. And Dan wondered why this is, because the thing was, they could have said anything. They could have said 15. They could have said 20. There was no way to prove them wrong, as far as they knew. But nobody did. Nobody even said 10. Nobody lied in a big way, but everybody lied in a little way. Everybody lied a couple 2, 3, 4. Average was 7, they said. 3 extra than they actually did. And he wondered why this is. And he had this theory that everybody sees themselves as a good person. So you don't want to do something that's bad because you can't see yourself as a good person. You know, you've got this, on one hand, good behavior, on the other hand, bad behavior, and they're separated by this bright line, good and bad. But he theorized that that bright line wasn't so bright. That actually, he called this the personal fudge factor. And his theory was everybody has this area, this range of acceptable deviation from what's moral. This area of behavior where they just kind of pretend it didn't happen. They just kind of fudge it. And as long as they can fudge it, they can still consider themselves to be a good person, which means they can lie a little bit and still be okay. And this really seemed to kind of explain why people didn't lie in big ways, but everybody kind of lied in little ways. So this gives me my very first rule. Everybody cheats. And I'm going to use the phrase cheat to refer to all behaviors that are not good behaviors. Lying, stealing, whatever it is. I'm going to use the phrase cheat to refer to all of those. So my first rule is everybody cheats a little bit. As long as that cheating behavior falls within that range of acceptable deviation from moral behavior. As long as it falls within that fudge factor. Everybody cheats a little bit. So Dan then changed the experiment. And here's what he did. He brought in a group, he gave them the sheet of paper, but he gave them a second sheet of paper. And this sheet of paper was blank. And he said, before you begin your test, I want you to write down the 10 commandments. As many as you can. Write down the 10 commandments. Turns out nobody could list all 10 commandments, but everybody could list a couple. They wrote down the 10 commandments. They said, okay, now begin your test. You got 5 minutes. I'll give you $1 for every one you complete. Nobody cheated. Thought, well, this is interesting. Is it a religious thing? Turns out it wasn't a religious thing. When he ran the test multiple times, even self-proclaimed atheists, when they wrote down the 10 commandments, didn't cheat. Thought, is it a 10 commandments thing? Well, it turns out it wasn't a 10 commandments thing at all. In fact, if he used any kind of moral code, if he gave people a paragraph of the honor code and told them to write that paragraph, they didn't cheat. This even worked at MIT, where they don't even have an honor code. So that gives us our second rule. Everybody cheats a little bit as long as it falls within that fudge factor. But when you remind people of a moral code, they don't cheat. It's as if that moral code erases that fudge factor and it draws that bright line between good and bad. Dan did another variation of this experiment. This time he changed 2 factors. When students came in, he gave them the piece of paper and he gave them an envelope with $20. He gave them the money ahead of time. But he said, I'm going to let you keep $1 for every problem you finish, and for every problem you don't finish, you've got to pay me back. So now they have to give up something. The second thing that he changed was he brought in an actor. He brought in somebody who pretended to be a participant, a fellow student. So they begin the test, and 30 seconds into the test, exactly at 30 seconds, this actor would stand up and would announce to the class, I'm done, I completed all 20. Dan would say, great, go back to the back of the room, shred your paper, and you're free to go. Which he would promptly do, he'd go shred his paper, and he'd walk out. And everybody would see someone who blatantly cheated and got away with it. Because there's no way that he finished one problem, much less all 20 problems. And he got to keep the money. Do you think this increased the cheating? Well, the answer to that really depended on what kind of sweatshirt the actor was wearing. You see, in the town where he first did this experiment, there are 2 universities. There's MIT and there's the University of Philadelphia, and they were rivals. He did this at MIT, and when the actor was wearing an MIT shirt, cheating increased. But when the actor was wearing a University of Philadelphia shirt, cheating went down. And we get our third rule from this. And our third rule is people are going to behave the same way that other people in their in-group behave. And they're going to shun behaviors of the out-group. In other words, we do what our peers do. Now, these three rules really seem to me, explain a lot of what I saw in the real estate market, a lot of what I saw in the convenience store market. But it didn't explain a lot of what I saw in North Dakota. I want to tell you about Ryan Olness. Ryan Olness was one of the original partners in Blackstone. He was one of the original 3 partners. When I met Ryan Olness, he was 25 years old. He owned his own company. He was well on his way to becoming a millionaire. He was a very stand-up, outgoing, successful personality. And I liked Ryan. A couple months after I met Ryan, Ryan was in Arizona and he was driving in the desert. As he was driving, talking in the middle of nowhere, he sees a plane fall out of the sky and crash. A small 2-person plane crash in the desert. Without hesitation, Ryan pulled off the road, drove across the desert to this plane. By the time he got there, the plane was on fire. Not having any concern for his own safety, he still ran over to the plane. He pried the door open. He cut the passenger loose. Both passenger and pilot were unconscious. He cut the passenger loose and he dragged him to safety. No sooner had he gotten away from the plane than something in the plane caught fire and exploded, killing the pilot. If Ryan had been 30 seconds slower, he would have been dead. If it had been another 2 minutes, he would have been dead because he would have gone back for the pilot. This impressed me. This is moral fiber. This is somebody who is willing to sacrifice himself for a complete stranger. This was somebody I wanted to work with. In February 2012, let me back up. In December 2012, Ryan sold his company. He sold his home. He sold everything he had in Arizona, and he moved to North Dakota to help us run the company. He had invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in North Dakota. He had been there for 2 months. It's February 2012. He arrived at work about noon on this particular day, February 22nd. He arrived at noon precisely because he had been up all night fixing a problem. That's what we did. As he's walking across the parking lot, James comes out of the service garage, giddy as a school child. Brags to Ryan that he just killed Casey, and Casey's bleeding out in the garage right then. I have no idea what was going through Ryan's head. I have no idea. I really don't. Here's a young man who literally had invested everything he had into this company, had given up everything to be here, and his business partner just said he murdered somebody who might not even be dead yet, who's bleeding out in the garage 20 feet away. I don't know what went through his head. I don't know what decision-making process that he went through. I know what he did. Nothing. He did nothing. He went into his office, he shut the door, and he did nothing. He told no one. But it was worse than that. You see, the next day, James drove the hired killer. His name was Timothy Suko. He was the same killer that killed Carlisle. He drove Suko to the train station because Suko was actually from Washington State. He'd taken a train to North Dakota, specifically to kill Casey. James was taking him back to the train station, and Suko said, "Hey, by the way, you haven't paid me yet." James wasn't really good at paying people. James calls Ryan. Says, "Ryan, I need you to bring me $10,000. Ryan says, "Where do you want me to get the money?" He says, "Your money. I need you to bring me $10,000 of your money. Bring it in an envelope." Ryan does. Ryan meets him on the side of the road with an envelope with $10,000, and he hands it to James, and he watches as James hands it to Suko, knowing full well who that guy was and what he had done. There's no getting around what happened at that day. And Ryan still said nothing. Most psychologists agree that one of the predominant reasons that people lie is to avoid consequences. So I borrow a little bit from that rule and apply it to this situation. Because I think people engage in cheating and bad behavior to avoid consequences, specifically if there is a risk of substantial loss. When a person has the potential of a substantial loss, Ryan was going to lose everything, his business, his savings. When people are faced with substantial loss, they are much more likely to cheat. We're all much more likely to cheat to avoid loss. And that includes losing a job, losing money, losing that sale, losing our reputation. I bet if you think really hard, actually, I don't think you have to think very hard, and you can probably think of somebody that has lied in order to save their own reputation. It's actually quite frequent. It's quite common. So it's our fourth rule. When faced with the potential of risk of loss, people cheat. Finally, our fifth rule. This is what my wife calls the snowball effect. Imagine you take a snowball, you pack it together, start rolling it on a hill. And when you first start rolling it, it's small, and it takes a lot of effort. You gotta push and push. And as it starts rolling, it starts getting more snow, and it starts packing more, it's getting more mass, and as it starts going down the hill, it starts to pick up speed. And it picks up more momentum and speed, and more momentum and speed, it's picking up more mass, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger until it's got a life of its own. Till you have this huge mass that's rolling down the hill full of momentum. Bad behavior, cheating, builds momentum. The first time that you do it may actually be hard. But the next time, not so much. The time after that, a little bit easier. And the time after that, easier still. And it builds momentum. The good news is it works in the opposite as well. The more good things you do also build momentum. So I took these 5 rules, and I found that these 5 rules are really effective in helping me to not only not cheat in my own life, but to be aware of situations where other people are likely to cheat me. And if I can have you take anything from this talk, I've got 3 recommendations, or 3 things I would like you to understand. Number 1, as a recommendation, stand for something. Our first 2 rules said that everybody lies a little bit, but when you have a moral code and you're reminded of a moral code, you don't. So create a moral code, your own personal moral code. When my son was 5 years old, my wife and I sat down with him and said, what kind of a person do you want to be? When you're at school, what kind of a person do you want your classmates and your teachers to think you are? And we made a list of the things that he said he wanted to be, the types of characteristics he wanted. And we wrote those down, we put those in his own personal mission statement, we printed it, we put it in a frame, we put it next to his bed so he could see it every day. So he could be reminded of the kind of person that he wanted to be. So he could be reminded daily of that moral code. So I suggest each of you go home tonight and do that. Write your own personal moral code. Make it specific. Identify exactly what you want to be and how you want people to think of you. And then, once you've identified those things, be those things. I always tell people, if you tell me the type of person that you want to be, or you tell me who you're supposed to be, I'm going to tell you you failed. Because who you are should permeate everything you do. So if you have to tell me who you are, you failed. Don't tell me you're a kind, courteous, nice person. Show me you're a kind, courteous, nice person. Write your moral code. Second, surround yourself with good people. We do what our peers do. My mom used to always say, you're going to be judged by the company you keep. And I'd always think, that was so unfair. I'm not my friends. I'm an independent person. I make my own decisions. Why should I be judged by their dumb decisions? And it's not necessarily that we're judged by their dumb decisions. It's that when we spend sufficient time with those people, we become like them. Which means those dumb decisions may one day become our dumb decisions. So be aware of who you spend your time with. In fact, take a really good look at who you spend a lot of time with, because you're likely to become just like them, for good or bad. And finally, build momentum. You can build momentum in a positive, good way. Establish your moral code. Decide what it is what it takes to be a moral person. And then do it, and do it consistently. Do it when it's hard. Do it when it takes actual effort, and do it when it takes you thinking about it. Be intentional about it. But do it. When you do those things, people will notice. And people will judge you and determine you to be those things. So do those things that you can stand behind. And then stand behind the things that you do. Thank you.
Good job.
Thank you.
Appreciate
Went a
it.
little bit longer than I expected.
No, that's okay. That's okay.